Well, welcome back. Um, in today's session, I will be building on what we discussed in the prior uh, conversation. But just to recap, in the prior session, I took some time to look at and to address the concept of risk and its relationship to returns. You may have heard investors talk about the importance of achieving a high return on your allocated capital or high return on invested capital. One of the reasons I had wanted to talk about a risk is because the actual approach that one should always have in mind should be risk adjusted return. In other words, the return you earn should be measured alongside the amount of risk that you've taken. So if you're buying a property, every property comes with a certain uh, quantity of risk. That quantity of risk should be considered as part of your overall analysis. And this is partly why it's sometimes very difficult to compare one property to another without knowing all of the intricate details of each of the properties. Every property varies. Even properties on the same, local, in the same local borough, on the same street, will vary. And in yesterday's session, I used the concept of what's called a capital market line. And I tried to show that the relationship between risk and return can be illustrated by way of a line. And as you go out in pursuit of more return, you would have to, by default, seek opportunities which might lend you a promise of a higher return, but at the same time, it would also require that you take a little bit more risk. You go off out of the risk up the risk curve, and that was what we discussed yesterday. I used the explanation to bring together the concept of your hurdle rate, which is the minimum level of return that you would accept for investing in a property. And that's where we will build on from today. If you're investing money in a property, there has to be an minimum acceptable hurdle rate that you would accept for investing. This concept, I have to say, can be quite complicated for a lot of people, but it doesn't have to be. I'm going to explain the concept holistically, and then I'll make it more focused. But please just bear with me as I try to explain the concept. Let's imagine that you have three people: A, Mr. B, and Mrs. C. Each of these investors have £100,000 to invest. Because they're individually different people, they would have different objectives. So the first thing is to state is that they have different objectives. Their objectives will define the strategy they apply to their investment process. So then you have a strategy. This strategy will enable them identify a tactical approach to invest in their funds. Once they've defined the objective and the strategy and the tactics, they overlay this on what we call a time period, time horizon. In other words, I have £100,000 to invest. I want to have all of my objectives met Therefore, the strategy that can be used is X. The tactics that can be used to achieve the strategy is Y, and all of that should be achieved within a certain time period. Complicated, but also simple. Let me translate that. Mr. A might say, my objective is that I am a pensioner. And therefore, because I am a pensioner, I need to earn a 7% return on my investments because I need the income to meet my day-to-day or annual expenses. That 7% return, he understands or he agrees that 2% will be capital appreciation. He understands that the remaining 5% would be income before taxes. And from the 5%, he intends to pay taxes. Mr. B, on the other hand, could be a younger person who does not need income, and therefore he might have an investment hurdle rate of 8%. He might say, I really don't need income. I don't mind if the money is reinvested, but in any case, I want 8%. Mrs. C might say, I need 10%, but I want that 10% to be distributed between different asset classes. Now, everything I've explained so far is how the investment process begins at the individual level. You have to define the objectives. You have to define a strategy. There'll be a tactical approach used, and then you have to overlay all of those on a time period. The hurdle rate then becomes what you use as a benchmark for selecting investments. So therefore, this hurdle rate becomes your risk or your discount rate. What this simply means is that any investment Mr. A, Mr. B, or Mr. C chooses has to meet this minimum threshold. Translated or said differently, the return on invested capital for Mr. A has to be greater than his hurdle rate. And this is where the concept of rate of return comes in. Return on capital, return on equity. And we'll get into that shortly. But the point I'm trying to make is that at the start of the whole process, you have to define the goal you want. Begin with the end in mind. And the end in mind is, I need to achieve a minimum hurdle rate of 7%. And therefore, my return has to be greater than 7%. Now, let me switch this up and I'll connect this back to yesterday's session. Mr. A is going to be buying the property he likes in cash. Mr. B will be buying the property using debt, 100% debt. Mrs. C will be using a combination of cash plus debt. We call this the funding arrangement. Now, I am explaining this so you can understand and so you can connect three different concepts. Investing, connect that to financing, and connect that to cash flow. So depending on what you want from your investment and how you finance, both would determine how much cash flow, free cash flow, you get from your investment. So if you were to look at this funding arrangement, now follow the numbers for the sake of this conversation. In my book, Ins and Outs, I go into some length and I provide you with a detailed breakdown of how to do all these calculations. I will not be able to do that in this session because it does take some time. If you would like to understand that a little bit more, then refer to the book. The point I'm trying to get at here is one of the mistakes that we all make is when we are investing, we assume that the way we fund and the funding rate should be the minimum hurdle rate, and that is not correct, as you will see in a few seconds. Your hurdle rate is not the same as your funding rate, not always. If Mr. A was purchasing the property in cash, if his cost of equity, because if you're paying in cash, it's all equity. If the cost of equity was 6.5%, then the 6.5% will be below his minimum hurdle rate of 7%. If Mr. B was funding with debt, let's say his cost of debt was 4.5%. Therefore, his cost of funding will be less than his minimum hurdle rate. And likewise, if Mrs. C is using a combination of equity and debt, you'd find that the cost, when you take the weighted average cost, depending on whether she's using, a 75% loan to value mortgage, using that as an example, you might find that her cost of funding, when you've taken the cost of debt and the cost of equity and combined both, hers might come up to, say, 3.75%. Again, her cost of funding is less than her minimum hurdle rate. Now let me show you why this should never be the strategy you should use. By strategy, I'm referring to replacing the hurdle rate with the funding cost. We call all of this cost of capital. If it's equity only, we call it cost of equity. If it's debt that you're using, 100% debt, we call that cost of debt. And if it's a combination of debt and equity, we call that your weighted average cost of capital. In this case, it's a combination of debts and equity. Now let me show you how important this is, because this is where most investors lose money. They transfer money from themselves to the seller. Let's say you found a property and the property can produce a free cash flow, in this case, of, let's use £15,000. To make it more easy for you to appreciate the extent of what I'm referring to, let's assume that the property, this is annual. Let's assume that the revenue, gross revenue from the property, is £20,000 annually, which translates, let me just get my calculator, which translates to roughly £1,700 per month. That's a number you and I can relate to, can understand. £1,700 per month. Let's say this is a 2-bedroom flat in London. Revenue £20,000 annually. The cash flow, free cash flow, after spending all, paying for all bills, is £15,000. I want you to watch and see how the discount rates that you use in your analysis affect the amount you pay. At £15,000, if we assume that the £15,000 will be the free cash flow generated by the property and there will be no growth, zero growth in perpetuity, zero growth. If we use the formula CF, 1 plus R, N, but because this is in perpetuity, we translate that formula to CF, N, R minus G. In this case, 15,000, which is the cash flow, divided by, we begin first with the hurdle rate, the minimum acceptable hurdle rate. 7%. What this means is that using the hurdle rate for Mr. A, 1500 or 15,000 divided by 0.07, that would mean that the property that Mr. A is buying should not be any more, or rather, the price of the property should not be any more than £214,000. In other words, what he's willing to pay for the property should be £214,000 or less. If he was to use the 6.5%, this is Mr. A. Instead, if he said, well, put aside all of the hurdle rate, I'm just going to use my cost of funding, 6.5%, then that £15,000 becomes 230,769. So the maximum he would pay for the property is £230,000, 769. Let's look at Mr. B. At 4.5%, the same property, Mr. B will be willing to pay for the same property £333,333, which is roughly 55% greater than Mr. A was willing to pay, simply because Mr. B has used his cost of funding. On the other hand, had he used his 8% hurdle rate, the maximum he would have been willing to pay would have been £187,500. And then for Mrs. C, 15,000, she would have been happy to pay £400,000 for the same property, whereas had she used her hurdle rate of 10%, she would have had to pay £150,000 maximum. Now, when you look at these numbers, what you find is a staggering change, a staggering level of variation between the maximum price or what the property would be valued at. When I talk about the maximum price, in principle, I'm saying this is the value of the property, and they shouldn't be paying more than this value. But let's not focus too much on the hurdle rate. Let's just look at the cost of funding. What you have here is a discrepancy between £214,000 to 85 and the maximum of £400,000. Same property. The difference is each of these people have different funding costs. The reason we do not use the funding cost is because this funding cost is subject to change. So for example, the cash and the cost of equity for using cash changes with time because the premium of risk, the risk premium, changes every day in the market. Likewise, the UK risk-free rate changes every day. If you recall from yesterday's session, I made reference to the fact that in order to define what the risk of the investment is, you begin with the risk-free rate and then you add the risk premium. And that gives you a discount rate. So every day, the risk-free rate changes and the premium of risk in the market changes. And therefore, as an investor, you should be mindful of the fact that you cannot use, or you cannot be fixed in your analysis. You have to recognize that there are changes happening to the landscape. Investors are asking more to take a risk or asking for less. And what this simply means is that the way I've always approached all investments is I've always said, as a minimum, even if you're going to be funding with debt and equity, or if you're going to be funding with debt only, you must forgive me, what I meant here was 3.75%, and this should have been 3.5%, in which case It should have been 428,571. Yeah, because the cost of debt would be less than the cost of equity, but it would also be less than the cost of debt and equity, which makes sense. So I've always been of the view that you should never use a value less than the actual cost of equity, because this is your cash. If you're buying in cash, that's your money, and therefore the cost of allocating all of your money needs to reflect the price of risk in the market and the risk-free rate. When you start using debt, debt has a way of reducing the overall cost of funding. And one of the reasons for that is because debt is usually cheaper than equity. Again, I'll make reference to this in the next session, but there is something called the basic accounting equation, which states that assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity. So debt is always cheaper than equity, because the first claim on the asset are the creditors. The residual claim are the equity investors. So for people to invest using cash, they're taking all of the risks once the creditors have been paid. But in any case, they retain the residual risk. Therefore, they charge more. Whereas the creditors, they have a claim on the asset itself, and therefore the cost of funding is less. So irrespective of how you're funding a property purchase, you should always use the minimum cost of equity as a benchmark in all your analysis. So the right approach for Mr. A, Mr. B, and Mr. C in this process would be this. 6.5% is almost like a fail-safe, is the bottom of the floor, 6.5%. And then, because you are taking the risk as the investor, you can decide that your minimum hurdle rate has to be 7%, so that you get something, you get an extra 0.5% for taking risks, or for taking the risk of allocating your capital on an asset. That is the best approach to follow. Never use your cost of funding. The point I'm trying to get here is, and I hope I've made this as clear as it should be. The point I'm making here is, if you were to look at these three values, by pricing on the cost of equity using cash, the maximum value of the property is 214,000. If, on the other hand, you were to use a combination of debt and equity at 3.75%, you would be willing to pay £400,000. Now, let's just say, for the sake of this conversation, that we said that the property was on the market for £200,000. Certainly, properties in London are not worth £200,000. If the property was on the market for £200,000, and let's also pretend that this was 2009, at £214,000, that's the value, and this is the price. You would say that the property is roughly 7%. The value of the property is 7%, price that is roughly 7% discount to its value, and so you would find the investment to be very attractive. In 2021, a two-bedroom flat in London, depending on where you are, will cost you much more. On the average, it would be roughly about 70,000 pounds. You would also then say that at 214,000 pounds, which is what your value is, you would say that the property is priced at a significant overvaluation, at a significant premium to the value. In other words, you would say the property is priced at 119% premium to its estimated value. But if you were funded with debt and equity, with a mortgage from the bank, and if you had used the cost of funding as your hurdle rate, you would find the property to be worth £400,000. In which case, at £400,000, if you estimated, if that was your estimated value and the price was 470, you would easily say, well, it's £470,000 and I think is worth £400,000. Therefore, it's only selling at a 17.5% premium to its value. Most people would justify their purchase. They might negotiate the price down to say £449,000. At £449,000 divided by 400, they would say, well, we bought the property at 12.2% above its estimated value, and in a short while, the price will grow, the value will grow, and therefore the price we paid will be justified. What you can see here is a huge discrepancy. Mr. C would have been paying £17,000, 17.5% above her estimated value by using her cost of capital or cost of funding. Mr. A would have said, no, the property is 119% of a premium above its value. Here is the most important thing I can say. If both of them had to make a decision on whether to buy or to walk away, Mr. A would have walked away from the deal. The difference between the £400,000 and the £214,285 is £185,000. If Mrs. C had proceeded and purchased the property, she would have been transferring £185,000, 715 of her wealth to the owner. The reason her investment would not have been shrewd is simply because in estimating the value of her cost of funding or the cost of her funding, she used the cost of debt and she used the cost of equity. The reason her cost of funding was much less than Mr. A is Mr. A assumed that he was paying in cash and therefore he had to make a return consistent with the risk he was taking. Mrs. C, on the other hand, went on the assumption that she was raising a significant amount of the purchase price or the purchase sum from a bank, from a mortgage, and therefore the reason is 3.75% as her cost of funding is because possibly maybe let's say 75% of that is a loan and 25% is her equity. So she's saying in principle, I'm only using 25% of my equity. I'm using other people's money. And therefore, my cost of funding is less. What this would translate to is that she would say, I have to only make a 3.75% return on my invested capital. And I'll be okay. The problem with that is we go back to the capital market line. And in the prior session, I gave you examples. I explained that if Mrs. C, this is a very, very important statement to make. If Mr. A would only accept 6.5%, and if you were to plot the other assets on this capital market line, you would find that investment grade stocks, perhaps they would produce 6% or 5.5%, for example. Investment grade bonds would produce 5%. Mr. A wants 6.5%. Mrs. C is happy to accept 3.75%. What you then find is that if we were to plot Mr. A's capital market line, you would have an upward sloping line where all the assets have a return that is consistent with the amount of risk being taken, and therefore all assets are in a state of equilibrium. Whereas if you were plotting Mrs. C's capital market line, you would have something like this. Stocks. So we say bonds, stocks at 5%. Mrs. C would be somewhere here, 3.75%. And then you go back to private equity, I'd say 7 or 8%. So you have a line like this, like that, like that, like that, which means that Mrs. C is accepting more risk from a property than she should have, because she could always invest in a less risky asset like stocks or bonds and achieve a higher return for less risk. That would simply mean that Mrs. C is overpaying and she's accepting too low a return. Now, I hope that makes sense. I'm going to stop for today and hopefully pick it up in the next session.